When you hear the word knight, what do you imagine? Shining armor reflecting the sun? Epic, choreographed battles on grassy fields? A brave, flawless warrior protecting a kingdom with a smile? This is the version of knighthood we've been sold by Hollywood and fairy tales. We see the glory, the gold, and the chivalry. But the real life of a medieval knight was far removed from a movie set. It was a life defined by physical exhaustion, the constant smell of sweat and oiled metal, and the crushing weight of expectation. It didn't start with a ceremony and a celebration. It started with years of grueling training, painful discipline, and the cold reality of violence. Some boys began this journey at just 7 years old, essentially losing their childhood to the pursuit of war. Many of these boys never lived long enough to see their hair turn gray. Today, we are going to peel back the polished steel and explore the true, brutal, and fascinating life of a medieval knight from the first day a boy left home to the final, bloody moments on a battlefield. A knight's life did not begin on the back of a horse. It began in the halls of a cold, stone castle. When a boy from a noble family reached his 7th birthday, his life as he knew it ended. He was sent away from his mother and father to the castle of a superior lord or a relative. This wasn't a boarding school for academics, it was a military academy for the elite. At age 7, these boys were known as pages. Imagine being that young and being thrust into a world of strict hierarchy. Your new life was filled with menial tasks that were designed to break your ego and teach you service. Pages were essentially high-ranking servants. They spent their days serving food to knights during great feasts, learning how to carve meat with precision, and pouring wine without spilling a drop. They were responsible for cleaning the filth off expensive armor and running messages through the winding, drafty corridors of the fortress. However, this wasn't just busy work. By cleaning the armor, the page learned how the joints of the suit moved. By serving the lord, he learned the complex social politics of the court. When they weren't working, they were practicing. They were given wooden swords to bash against the quintain, a wooden post with a rotating arm. If the page hit the target but wasn't fast enough to move, the wooden arm would swing around and knock him into the mud. They also had to learn the 7 agilities: riding, swimming, archery, climbing, fencing, long jumping, and wrestling. There were no weekends off. Every mistake was met with a sharp clip around the ear or a more severe physical punishment. They were also taught that they were soldiers of Christ, meaning they spent hours in chapel learning that their sword was a tool of divine will. Around the age of 14, if the page had proven himself resilient, he was promoted to a squire. This is where the transition from boy to man-at-arms truly began. A squire was no longer just a servant in the castle. He was the shadow of a specific knight. Think of a squire as a personal assistant, a mechanic, and a bodyguard all wrapped into one. His life revolved entirely around his master's needs. He had to dress the knight, a process that could take over 20 minutes of buckling straps and tightening leather laces. He had to maintain the weapons, ensuring the swords were razor sharp and the lances were straight. But the most important and dangerous task was caring for the destrier, or the war horse. These weren't friendly ponies. They were massive, aggressive stallions trained to kick and bite enemies in battle. A squire had to master these beasts, often riding them while carrying heavy equipment. This was the teenage phase of knighthood, but there were no parties or carefree days. Squires were often taken into actual war zones. While they weren't usually on the front lines of the initial charge, they stood just behind the lines. If their knight was unhorsed, the squire had to rush into the chaos to provide a fresh horse or pull his injured master to safety. They saw the blood and heard the screams of the dying long before they were ever allowed to strike a blow themselves. They learned the most vital lesson of the medieval world. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the ability to function while your heart is hammering against your ribs in terror. After 7 years as a page and another 7 to 10 years as a squire, a young man might finally reach the moment of knighthood. But this wasn't guaranteed. Knighthood was incredibly expensive. You had to own horses, multiple suits of armor, and have the funds to maintain a household. Many squires remained armigerous their whole lives, meaning they had the right to bear arms but could never afford the formal title of knight. If a squire was brave in battle or exceptionally loyal, he would undergo the ceremony of dubbing. The night before was a spiritual marathon. The candidate would bathe a rare occurrence to symbolize ritual purification. He would then dress in a white tunic and spend the entire night in a cold church, standing vigil over his armor in total silence and prayer. The next day, the ceremony was often public. He would kneel before a king, a duke, or his own mentor. The Lord would tap him on the shoulders with a sword, the accolade, and deliver a collé, which was originally a hard blow to the face or neck with a hand. This was to be the last blow the knight ever received without returning it. With those words spoken, he was no longer a common man. He was part of an international elite. But the celebration was short-lived. The moment he stood up, he was now legally and morally bound to a code of chivalry that was almost impossible to live up to. He was now a target for every enemy looking to make a name for themselves. To understand the knight, you have to understand his gear. A knight was the most expensive piece of military hardware in existence, the F-35 fighter jet of the 13th century. A full suit of plate armor was a masterpiece of engineering. It consisted of dozens of individual plates of steel, articulated so perfectly that a knight could actually perform a somersault or climb a ladder. Contrary to the myth that knights were hoisted onto horses with cranes, a fit knight was incredibly mobile. The weight, around 25 kilograms, was distributed across the entire body, rather than hanging off the shoulders. However, the heat was the real enemy. Inside a steel suit under the summer sun, temperatures could reach dangerous levels. Knights often suffered from heat exhaustion and dehydration long before a sword ever touched them. Then there were the weapons. The longsword was a backup. The primary weapon of a knight was the lance. When a knight charged at 20 miles per hour on a 1,500-pound horse, the kinetic energy at the tip of that lance was enough to punch through shields and mail alike. He also carried a mace, or a war hammer, brutal, blunt instruments designed specifically to crush the armor that swords couldn't cut. But this gear cost a fortune. The cost of a horse, a suit of armor, and weapons could equal the price of a small village. This is why knights were almost always from the upper class. Nobody else could afford to be a tank. When we think of medieval war, we think of heroic duels. The reality was a meat grinder. When two lines of armored men clashed, it wasn't a dance, it was a riot. The battlefield was a place of sensory overload. The smell of horse manure and iron, the deafening clang of steel on steel, and the slippery footing of blood-soaked mud. Because plate armor made men hard to kill with traditional slashing, battles often devolved into wrestling matches. Knights would tackle each other to the ground and use a misericord, a thin mercy dagger, to stab through the eye slit of the helmet or the armpit where the armor was weak. There was also the dark side of ransom. Because knights were noblemen, they were worth more alive than dead. If a knight was captured, his family would have to sell land and gold to buy his freedom. This meant that poor foot soldiers were slaughtered without thought, while the knights were often spared not out of kindness, but out of greed. And if you weren't killed by a sword, the infections would get you. A small scratch from a rusty blade or a piece of dirty padding forced into a wound could lead to a slow, agonizing death from sepsis days after the glory of the battle had faded. What did a knight do when there wasn't a war? He was a politician and a landlord. A knight was usually granted a fief, a piece of land by his lord. In exchange for his military service, he got to keep the taxes and crops produced by the peasants living on that land. He spent his days holding court, settling disputes between villagers, and managing the local economy. It was a life of administration. To keep their skills sharp, they participated in tournaments. While we see these as sporting events, they were originally melees, basically mock battles where groups of knights would charge at each other in open fields. It was common for people to die in these games. Even jousting, the most famous of knightly sports, was a way to practice the charge. It was a high-stakes, high-glamour, and high-fatality hobby. A knight's life was a constant cycle of preparing for violence, engaging in violence, or recovering from violence. So, the next time you see a knight in a movie, or see a suit of armor standing silent in a museum, try to look past the shine. The medieval knight wasn't a superhero. He was a man trapped in a system of constant struggle. He was the boy who was sent away at 7. He was the teenager who spent his youth scrubbing blood off shields. He was the warrior who lived with the constant weight of steel on his bones and the fear of a dagger in the dark. The shining armor was just a shell. Behind it was a human being living in one of the harshest, most unforgiving periods of human history. Chivalry was often more of an ideal than a reality, a desperate attempt to bring order to a world of chaos. The medieval knight may look heroic today, but his life was defined by 3 things movies rarely show: exhausting discipline, extreme cost, and the cold, hard struggle for survival. That is the true story of the man behind the medal.